Hello and welcome to Zócalo Public Square. I'm Judy Campbell. I'm a public radio producer at KQED in San Francisco, and I'm excited to be here with Jessica Garrison, who's the senior investigations editor for BuzzFeed News. She was previously a journalist at the LA Times for over a decade. Jessica is also the author of The Devil's Harvest, a ruthless killer, a terrorized community, and the search for justice in California's Central Valley, which was released this August. In one sense, The Devil's Harvest is a true crime story chronicling a hitman who claims to have killed 36 people over several decades, but it's also much more than that. It's also the story of the cultural forces that have shaped the Central Valley and the effects of decades of neglect on an overlooked community. And it's all aimed at addressing this question that's at the heart of the book, and I'm quoting here from the book. How could someone get away with murder after murder for more than 30 years while living in a sleepy, close-knit farm worker town where everyone knew everyone else? So Jessica Garrison, congratulations. It's a fascinating book. So tell us, how did you get into this story? What drew you to it?
Well, first of all,
And when did you hear about him? Yeah.
thank you so much for having me, and for asking that question. So I heard about that story. I first heard of Jose Martinez in the are we frozen? No, sorry, I live in fear of you.
We were slightly frozen.
But now we are unfrozen. Anyway, I first heard of the story in probably the spring of 2014. I was still at the LA Times, and I was working as the morning assignment editor, which is a job I was quite unsuited to because I am not a morning person at all. And so I came in every morning in a kind of a zombie, sleepy state. And that job is sort of like being the air traffic controller for the state. Like you kind of come in and you have to make sure that you have reporters everywhere that you might need to have them for story, so it's like maybe not a job you want to do if you're exhausted. But anyway, I came in and I would kind of come in with 2 cups of coffee and sit there and look at the wires to get a sense of, what's happening in the world. And I remember sort of holding a cup of coffee and reading the wire and seeing that a contract killer was being extradited from Alabama to California. And I don't remember if they said the town that he was from in the San Joaquin Valley. They might have. And I remember thinking, how on earth could you kill that many people and live in such a tiny town and not get caught for 30 years? And so I took a little bit more coffee and I called the Fresno bureau chief and woke her up and said, bad news, you have to get in your car, drive to Tulare County. And, the LA Times the reporters at the LA Times did a pretty kind of fantastic breaking news story on the case. That was just sort of like, here's this guy, he's being charged with, 9 murders in California. And then shortly after that, I left the LA Times and went to work at BuzzFeed. And I kept thinking about this case and sort of in the way that you do. I think a lot of reporters have sort of stories in the back of their mind, like I wonder if anyone ever did the kind of deeper look at what really happened here. And periodically I would check and nothing. And then one day I was kind of between projects and I checked and there was still kind of no big story on it. But I noticed that Mr. Martinez was due in court in Tulare County. And like that the next week. And I thought, maybe I'll just go see. So I got in my car, learned an important lesson about how accurate the timestamps that Google Maps gives you are, which is to say not at all. So I was a little bit late to the hearing, and got to this hearing and sort of watched this court case and just thought, this is fascinating. And then shortly after that, Mr. Martinez was charged in California with murders. He was also charged in Alabama with a murder, and then he was charged in Florida with murders. And Florida has incredibly open public records laws. And so I called up Florida to ask for the police reports on the murders there. And the clerk in Florida said, oh, do you want the California cases too? And I said, why, yes, I would, because you can't really
California is not easy to get those records.
I get that. Yeah. I was like, yes, please. So I got, thousands of pages of original handwritten police reports from California going back to, you know, his first murder was 1980, but there were other murders in there that went back to the 70s. And it was just, I was a history major in college, and it was like someone just dropped a history archive in my lap. And I pretty quickly realized, this is an incredible story of a crime, but it's also a story of this place. And that's how I got into it. And it just kept, every sort of stone I unturned yielded more kind of fascinating things.
Yeah, well, talk about the place. So early Mart, strange name. It started with sort of an optimistic future, right? And then it ended up at the nexus of just these enormous sort of international thing. Drug cartels, UFW is there. There's just outrageous disparities of the super rich and the super poor, right? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about early Mart and
So
what you
Jose,
learned
yeah, Jose Martinez he was born near Fresno, but he grew up in this town called Early Mart, which is like a lot of towns in the San Joaquin Valley, which is to say it's not actually a town. It's not incorporated. And like a lot of these towns, it was formed kind of by speculators, um, who were kind of drawing up settlements along railroads. So it's, on a railroad spur, on a railroad. And it's what's called Early Mart because the produce grown there is early to market. And it's a kind of in some ways, classic farm worker town. Many of the folks who live there are and were farm workers. And some of those folk, not many, some of those folks also got involved in the drug trade. And Jose Martinez comes from a family who his stepdad was a pretty big heroin smuggler in the 70s, which is how he got involved in drugs. And then unbeknownst to his family, he also got involved in contract killing. And he committed his first murder for hire in 1980. And then he continued to murder with impunity for decades before finally, I'm not even sure he got caught before he was brought to justice.
Yeah, I mean, so that was his first murder for hire, but he had murder before that, right? And the case of vengeance for his avenging the rape and murder of his sister. And I just found that interesting because even though he was a contract hire, it seems like his attitude towards a lot of these crimes had this real mission to it, this sort of nobility to what he was doing that seemed maybe fueled by this first sort of
So, I mean, I
protecting
think,
his family.
yes. So as he tells it, and I think,
Mhm.
he's never been charged with these 1978 murders, but I'm not sure anybody doesn't think that he committed them. He was raised in part, or a very important person when he was growing up was his half sister, who he really adored and who was kind of like a little bit of a second mother to him. And she was murdered in 1978, and her body was left on the banks of the Salton Sea in Riverside County. And he decided that he didn't believe that the police really cared or were really doing anything about that murder. And he decided to take matters into his own hands. He decided that he knew who was responsible. And as he tells it, he drove down to Riverside County, found 3 people that he believed were responsible, and killed them. And that, that's that he was never charged with those murders. That's a little bit of an open-ended mystery. But as he tells it, when he became a contract killer, he viewed himself also as sort of someone who avenged the men who did bad things to women. And there's some evidence in some of his murders that was a factor, by no means all. But he did have this sort of mystique that he would kind of take bad people out.
Yeah, and but he didn't, I mean, as you write, he doesn't ask a lot of questions about who he's asked to kill. He doesn't check. He makes a lot of mistakes, and as time goes on, he becomes, the murders become sort of more petty. Um, Disputes over, parking in his driveway, things like that.
I mean, there is one of the most sort of kind of hard to wrap your head around. I mean, I think it's hard to wrap your head around any murder, but I think one of the ones that is really just sort of like, what? Is that he murders a man for the alleged crime, of parking his driveway. Um, and then the sort of, even more extraordinarily, he dumps this body in an orange grove in Tulare County, and then learns, because it's a small community, that the man's mother is desperate and, just filled with like grief and anxiety about not knowing what happened to her son. And so he actually goes and moves the body so that it will be found. And even more kind of astonishing is that he murders this guy in his own truck, um, the murder victim's truck. But it's not actually, the truck doesn't belong to the murder victim. It belongs to his widowed sister-in-law. And after he murders the guy, he's like, the poor sister-in-law, like, she doesn't need this. Like, she's really going to need this truck. I know she needs this truck. And so he actually goes to a car wash, washes the blood out of the truck, not very well, is questioned by it by someone else at the car wash, um, and sort of has the absolute presence of mind to be like, oh, it's my kid's strawberry soda, and then returns the truck to the home of the widow whose brother-in-law he's just killed. I mean, it's just an absolutely, that murder is astonishing because you see both his sort of like, oh, I must care for women, and the absolute remorseless, cold-blooded murderousness of it all.
Yeah, an interesting, a weird sort of sentimentality, and then, yeah, but it's very clear he enjoyed his murders, and he has this real dichotomy, right? I mean, he's this family man who's so generous with his family. He's so loved in court. There's just such emotional stories that are told about how he's saved all these lives. He's been the protector of his family, and yet he's a killer who enjoys it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about there's so much injustice that's sort of at the heart of this, and it's kind of an interesting time to read this story now because we've been hearing so much about over prosecution of people of color. And a side that doesn't get as talked about, but is talked about often in communities of color, is the under prosecution of people who are perpetrating crimes against communities that don't have much power. And that's a huge part. I mean, there you have there are a lot of people, you have some great detectives working on these cases, but overall, the story is really that he was able to commit this many murders because these were murders against people that no one really cared about.
I mean, I think that was the thing, there are two things that drew me to this story. One is it's just a wild story. I mean, it takes, we go to Santa Barbara, we go to Florida, there's horses, there's, wine, it's an incredible, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this story. But the other thing that really drew me to it and made me think, is that there why was he allowed to get away with this? And when I started this project, one of the first things that I did was I sort of called up family members of people he had killed, and to my, they were in a lot of these, he killed a lot of people, and there was a great deal, many of these family members were in very different places in their lives. Some were quite well-to-do, some weren't, but they all had sort of the same thing to say, which is it really felt like no one cared that my father or my brother or my cousin was murdered, and that they just, this death just sort of slipped away, and yes, in some cases the family member said like the police really did work these cases hard. In other cases, they didn't feel like the police cared at all, but they just didn't feel like anybody cared. And that's what really drew me to this. Like, how can you get away with not one, not two, not three, not four, but murder after murder after murder after murder? And he was in the early murders, he wasn't necessarily a suspect, but by about 2000, he was a named person of interest in a lot of these murders. And yet, for whatever reason, and there were reasons, he was never charged and never kind of, nobody did anything. And that to me was the most shocking part of this story.
Yeah, and one thing that I found very sort of chilling of the whole thing is his awareness of that. I mean, I think you have a quote from him. He said one of his victims, he said, well, he clearly wasn't very important because a few weeks after his death, they stopped asking questions. So it's sort of this feedback loop. He was praying, these were his victims, and he saw that these were people he could kill.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean,
Yeah.
I think that to me, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think it's true that the story really kind of underscores that, our justice system cares more about some deaths than others.
Well, and there are also, I mean, there are so many factors that weave into this. And one, I mean, I found it interesting that this is an unincorporated area. So they don't have police. They
They
don't
have
have, they don't have a, right, they don't have like a police chief. There are sheriffs. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, like the difference between having a sheriff and
oh
who's,
no.
and how it plays into sort of whose needs are met, who is, as an elected sheriff, who they're sort of paying attention to.
Well, I mean, I think, these are so, sheriffs are elected, right? And they are elected by, typically the county, the voters of the county. And so I think it's just sort of simple math that tiny unincorporated communities that don't, have a lot of voters, right? Because a lot of people that live in these communities are immigrants and cannot vote. There are a lot of voters there too, but and certainly more than there were 30, 40 years ago. But I also think these are areas that tend to be kind of under policed. That it will take the sheriff 30 minutes to even get there, and so they tend to be places that people don't look to police to solve their problem. And I think the particular with Tulare County, it's also a place that has a pretty specific and negative history with the sheriff's department, because during the grape strike, the sheriff's department was perceived, I think, quite fairly as being on the other side of that fight. Um, and so you have communities that don't have a great relationship with local police. The police aren't there, they only see them when they come in, and they have to sort of make arrests, and they have this history of real kind of violent oppression. And I think all of that, I think that's changing, and I think there are people working to change it, but I think that is part of what went into perpetuating this.
Well, why is it? I mean, this is a place, there was a lot known about what was going on there. It sounds like, especially in terms of just the vast amount of drugs that were coming through and the Mexican drug cartel. Why was there no higher? Why was it just the underfunded sheriff that is dealing with this? Why wasn't there sort of federal look into this area? Why wasn't there, FBI, DEA?
I mean, you probably have to ask the FBI and the DEA. I think that there are drugs everywhere in California. And, I think that I can't really, the DEA was around. I mean, DEA was involved in the arrest of his stepfather in the 1970s. But I think the DEA, to look at the DEA, like they don't really view it, they don't deal with murder, right? They deal with drugs. I think it's an interesting question. Jose Martinez was killing people across state lines, right? But murder in the United States is local. And those are locally, each jurisdiction handles their own cases by and large.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many sort of underfunded things in this. I mean, part of the question you bring up the comparison with the Golden State Killer, who was it was shortly after, I guess, the Jose Martinez's court case that story got blown open and massive amounts of press, right? And very little for his case.
Right.
And I mean, I wonder how much the sort of the demand. Oh, I'm sort of curious of why. It's not like the media is usually accused of not talking enough about grisly murders. It seems like natural fodder. Why didn't this get any attention? Do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I
Yeah.
think I do think, the Golden State Killer, it's not a perfect comparison, right? But the Golden State Killer was, as in case anybody here doesn't know, was this former police officer who was accused of raping and murdering women, often white women, up and down the state for a long, long time. And I think that, when he was finally caught, the media went predictably bonkers. Now, he was in some ways like a more diabolical criminal, right? Because he broke into people's houses and like psychologically tortured them and then raped them. Um,
And
but
it
I
was
also
more random, right?
he was killing white women. And I do think that like I don't have a perfect answer to the question of like why people didn't, we are a state that loves to get captivated by serial killers. Right. I mean, we've had a number, we give them names. Why this one never sort of captured the imagination? Like I think perhaps it's because of the victims. And um
Well, the victims
I
were.
don't
Oh,
know.
sorry. There might have been a small freeze. I didn't know if you
Oh,
were done.
I'm
Or you were.
so sorry. I said, well, I don't know where you lost me.
Well,
But
no, just right at the end. You were saying that it might have been about the victims.
I mean, I do think it's possible that like, the media will go predictably bonkers um, if you have, in a situation where white women are, perceived to be victims in a way that they may not if the victims are perceived to be undocumented um, men who may or may not be involved in the drug trade.
Right. And there are such huge, I mean, during this period, there are waves of various things, right? And one is Proposition 187 of the targeting undocumented immigrants and services is passed towards the end, right? There's Trump coming in, with rallies nearby, I think. About undocumented immigrants. I mean, it seems like fear is a central part of this, and people being afraid to talk, to advocate them for themselves, and sort of the criminal justice system, also in just basic rights and services, which are, that a lot of people are really denied, right?
I mean, I think that's another thing about, I mean, I really tried to make the book about two things. I tried to make the book about this crime story, which stretches over, 40 years. Um, but it's also the story of a place. And it's a story of a place that has been sort of systematically denied services. We've talked a lot about police services, but this is also a place where in a lot of communities there is no potable water. Where in early Mart, one of the sort of most egregious environmental crimes, in California was committed, which is that half the town, not half the town, a large portion of the town was kind of gassed with a pesticide accident, which actually led to early Mart. It's a tiny little place. It's given us Jose Martinez, and it's also given us one of the sort of fiercest environmental justice advocates in the state. But it's a place that just although it is, in California, it doesn't always feel like California because, you don't have water. I mean, you don't have kind of basic municipal services, sidewalks, street lights. the roads are paved, but it's a running joke. If you type in like early Mart and like potholes, like you will be astonished by how much on the internet there is about people, because the roads are just, and I kind of knew this, and then I drove my car, I have a crack in my windshield because of a rock that flew up from under the road. I mean, it is a place that has, for whatever reason, most, neglect, not had the kind of services that I think we've come to expect in California.
Yeah, and I was interested to see, I mean, it was actually purposeful, right? I mean, after there was a time they, that it wasn't thought of as a viable community, so they were
Well, I mean,
starved of services. Is that right?
I think that was back in the 70s, but I think there are a lot of these little towns that just sort of sprung up, and they don't have, they don't have water. They aren't hooked up to the, main water systems. And I think the counties, throughout the San Joaquin Valley have sort of struggled with, what do we do about this? And when they don't, when these places also don't have political power, the answer to what do we do about this is very different than it would be if it was a rich unincorporated community that lacked these things. And the answer has often been to just let's ignore it and hope it goes away. But these are also wonderful communities, and they're full of people who live there and love it, and it's their home. And so these communities have not gone away. And I think I would never want to suggest that neglecting a community leads to a diabolical contract killer. Obviously it doesn't. But I think the book underscores the fact that we as a state really should think about how we want to allocate resources in our incredibly rich state, to address these incredible situations that we see in a lot of these communities.
So one thing that's really interesting about and Jose Martinez, and the fact that the reason you have this whole book is that he confessed, and he confessed and confessed and confessed and confessed, right?
Oh no.
Okay, why
Sorry,
do
can you repeat that?
Oh, if it's funny, I was just repeating the same word over and over. I was saying he confessed and confessed and confessed. I mean, he really spilled well, not really his guts, right? I mean, it didn't seem like necessarily a remorseful thing. But why, one, he talked to you, right? And he told all of this. Why do you think he did that? After
Um,
years of keeping it.
I mean, so the instant case, sort of the inciting incident was that he did it for the reason that he does a lot of things, which is to make his family's life better. And the particulars of that are that he'd gone to visit his daughter in Alabama. His daughter is got absolutely nothing to do with any crime, anything. I mean, she's just absolutely out of it and was living her life in Alabama. And he came to visit her, and while he was there, she was trying to launch a business. And he was desperate to help her with this business, and she kept telling him, you cannot help, you're not insured. And at some point, someone who kind of knew her said something about having a debt. And Jose Martinez, sort of desperate to help, was like, oh, a debt. I know from debt collection, because he was also a debt collector for drug cartels, and decides that he's going to help this acquaintance of his daughter's collect this debt, which was not a drug debt. It was a kind of a fairly boring business debt. And so he gets in the car with the guy who wants help collecting the debt, and the gentleman makes a terrible mistake, which is that Jose Martinez asks this man about his daughter's boyfriend, and the man says, oh yeah, the boyfriend's okay, but that blankety blank he's with, and insults his daughter. And Jose Martinez,
Not knowing that he was talking to the father.
not knowing that he was talking to her father. And Jose Martinez murdered him. And then, as he often did, got away, was not suspected, came back to California. And then police in Alabama eventually, they never ever thought that his daughter was involved in the murder, but they kind of made the connection that, she knew the guy, and they were kind of squeezing her. And more specifically, they were kind of squeezing her kid, they wanted to talk to her kids. And he was like, I don't want my family dragged into this. And so he came to Alabama and said, yeah, I committed that murder. And while we're on the topic, I got a whole bunch more that I'd like to confess to. And at first, police in Alabama were like, yeah, no, I mean, that's ridiculous. Like, they just did not believe him. And then they started looking into the murders that he was confessing to. And they eventually called police in Kern and Tulare County and learned that, not only was it not ridiculous that he was confessing this, but he was a suspect. And so they began closing. He was charged at that point with 9 murders in California. And he confessed to a whole bunch more. And to me, one of the most astonishing things, on top of all the other astonishing things, was that even with him confessing, they still, they have not closed a lot of these. And they have not, even though, in some specific cases, he's like, I killed that person on that date in that place. But they still have not charged him. So there's a lot more murders out there that he's trying to confess to that are still open.
And there are, yeah, police departments are turning down. They have too many murders to deal with, even though,
I mean, I think
it's
that
easy
it's,
flow.
it's a legally complicated question, right? Because, if, in order to prosecute him, they've got to charge him, and then they got to bring him here, and then they got to like spend all the money to do that. And if they've got no other evidence except him, if he decides to change his mind and not confess to it, they got nothing.
And part of the original motivation, right, was to get so that he doesn't stay in prison in the South, that he gets to come back to California, but he needs enough murder to be charged with enough murders in order to get sent back.
I mean, I think part of the reason, only he can really know, but I think he's at times said part of the reason he confessed to all these California murders. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. Like, one, I think was like, I'm done. I'm just going to confess. I think the other reason was that he did want to serve his time in California. And so to be near his family. But he did not count on Florida because he'd also committed a double murder in Florida. And, in yet another crazy twist to this case, Florida had a cigarette butt from the crime scene that they, for whatever reason, forgot to test for a number of years. Had they run it in 2006 when he committed that murder, it would have hit on Jose Martinez, because while he was never charged with murder, he'd been charged with some lesser crimes. And so he was in the system, but they forgot to test the cigarette butt. And then a cold case detective ultimately tested it right around the time that he confessed to murder in Alabama. So he was, extradited to California, pled out in California, and then extradited to Florida, where he faced a death penalty case. And that brought us to yet another kind of extraordinary twist, which is that a jury in Florida decided, after hearing all about his life, that he should not have the death penalty.
Pretty shocking.
I mean, I think a lot of people in that courtroom were shocked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was the testimony of the family and also his childhood, right? And
yes, his family flew out en masse to Florida and testified over several days, both about his childhood, kind of growing up in the middle of the grape strike, and about kind of what a loving person he was in that realm of his life.
So you talked to him. You wrote him a letter. He agreed to talk to you. One, vanity, is that, did he want to tell his story? I
don't know. I never know why anybody talks to a reporter.
Yeah.
I think he did want to tell his story.
And what did you think? One of the many factors in why I got away with it, some of it is just his charm, right? At one point, even though the police knew that he was involved in tons of things that they didn't have evidence for yet, but they made him a police informant, sort of, because he chatted with a police officer, right? So did you find him charming, and what did you make of him when you
I
met
mean,
him? Did it change the way you thought of the story meeting him?
so I mean, I think before I talked to him, I talked to a lot of police officers about him. Um, and almost, to a person, they talked about you would never, ever think this man was a murderer. Like he just seems like kind and helpful and kind of funny. Um, and so, I wrote him a letter and I never thought he would actually talk to me, right? I mean, I've written like a lot of letters to prison in my life. And usually you don't get an answer. Um, but he called me up. And it was, quite, I think the police descriptions were quite accurate. I mean, he's very polite. Um, he's very, he's quite charming. Um, and uh, he's also quite remorseless about having committed a lot of really horrible murders.
Um, I can't say there's a ton of sort of optimism in this book, but one place that is this idea of you have drawn a picture of a very neglected area with, you talked about the pesticide drift, and there are cancer clusters, there's undrinkable water, um, in recent years, it seems, and then there were a lot of people who were scared to advocate for themselves, partly because of maybe not being documented. But in recent years, you've seen sort of a change,
I mean,
it
I
sounds
should
like, and
say,
maybe there's yeah, go ahead.
like, I guess it is a pretty dark portrait. I love this part of Tulare County, right? I mean, it is beautiful. And, there's something just kind of, I mean, I encourage anyone driving up and down the 99 to get off and go and have like delicious food in early Mart and look at, particularly in the winter, you can kind of look out across the fields and see the Sierra spike up with these like, icy white peaks. It's beautiful. It's where our food comes from. We should all care about this place. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a place. It's a vital part of our state. Like I said, it's where anybody here, if you ate a fruit or a vegetable today, it probably came from the valley. So we're all connected to it, and it's a vibrant place. And I think there are a lot of people who live there who have always, but are still now, trying to make their community like a better, more just place, which I think is true everywhere. But, in what we've seen in recent years is like a lot of kids of farm workers who, in some cases have gone to school, to college and come back and said, why should we not have, you know, drinking water? Why should we not have good schools? Why should we not have parks? And are really kind of working to make that happen. And I think that, I tried to really kind of tell some of those stories in this book too.
Yeah, I found that um, it was a great part of this book, that in communities that before that success often meant leaving, now more people are staying and investing in their communities. Well, I want to thank you so much. We have to close now, but thank you, Jessica, for a great conversation. Congratulations on publishing an important book. And to everyone watching, thanks for joining us. You can visit zocalopublicsquare.org for a summary of this talk, additional writing, and more upcoming conversations. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.